is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you so much for joining us this week. This episode, I spoke with Cory Johnston, the host of the Hardcore Skeptic and Brainstorm podcasts. We had a great conversation about his deconversion, our respective podcasting projects, misconceptions about quote-unquote classical liberals and quote-unquote social justice warriors, and the complicated politics of free speech. We agreed on a lot and had some enlightening disagreements, which made the conversation even more rewarding. And with that, here's my conversation with Cory Johnston. Cory Johnston, how's it going, sir?
Not too bad. Yourself?
I am just fine, just fine. Thank you so much for meeting with me to talk on the podcast. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, ever since we met on Facebook, I've actually been, in the back of my head, I've always been like, okay, we got to talk to Justin on Skype or whatever, even if it's just a conversation.
That sounds great. Absolutely. So let's start with first your deconversion, how you became an atheist and a skeptic and sort of your journey. Were you always raised religious? Did you grow up non-religious? What's your story?
I guess you could say that it's a pretty standard story, moderately Christian upbringing. Things aren't, it was never really an issue. We always were, growing up as kids, we were always given the choice, go to church if you want, don't go to church, it doesn't matter. Until my parents divorced when I was around 11 or 12, and then my dad remarried when I was 15, and he had been an alcoholic for a while and found God around that age when I was 15 years old. So when him and my stepmom became born-again Christians, and they joined Amway at the same time, they insisted that we start going to various churches and or watching church on TV if we couldn't get to church. And they insisted that we tithe 10% of our chore allowance money, stuff like that. So then, I hated that. I hated giving up 10% of my money, and I just had never been religious until that time. So it seemed ridiculous to me that now all of a sudden I was supposed to change the way I looked at the world. And so I kind of rebelled a little bit, and I would go to the library and take out books on Satanism and witchcraft and freak out my parents so they'd have to call the local pastor and have a sit-down chat. But I was never really bought too much into the actual religious aspect of it. And I guess later on, like when I was exploring that Satanism and witchcraft as a rebellion, I kind of happened onto some kind of new agey philosophy, and I kind of bought into that for far too long. And
as one does when they're young and impressionable. I mean, I think that my version of new agey stuff was in college when I read a lot of postmodernists. I was reading Foucault and Habermas, and then really getting into the fiction work of people like Philip K. Dick and sort of the sci-fi stuff. So I have my sort of brush with that sort of new agey, not new agey necessarily, but sort of like deconstructionist philosophy that can often lead you astray.
Mm.
So
yeah, I was reading. I don't know if you know who Richard Bach is.
Yeah, I've heard of him. Never read any of his work. John Livingston Seagull, right?
Yeah, that's
Cool.
right. He also wrote a book called Illusions: The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah, about which basically it's very Deepak Chopra-esque type stuff. And so then I was reading a lot of his stuff. And I mean, it's interesting stuff to read if you don't take it literally. But we were impressionable and high as fuck all the time. So we learned a lot, and I took it very literally.
Right on. So when was the point for you that you stopped taking it so literally?
I guess it was right around the age of 30. I guess, let's see, 2007, that would be. So, yeah, I started watching Penn and Teller's bullshit, and I started, reading more and learning more. And that was about the time that I went on like a self-improvement kick, and I started just learning as much as I could. And that led me to call myself an atheist and kind of abandon a lot of those beliefs that aren't based on evidence.
That's cool. I'm very similar. So I became an out atheist in 2009. I was 19, and Penn and Teller's bullshit was actually very instrumental in my own atheism. A few years before, my father and I bought the first season on DVD, and we got it at there used to be a chain of video stores where I live. And when they went out of business, they had like these closeout stores where you can come and buy their inventory. And they had Penn and Teller's bullshit. My dad and I, not having any clue what it was, thought it was just magic stuff. And so we bought it, and then I just loved it. I mean, I watched those over and over and over and over again. And then from them, I got into James Randi, who was very, very instrumental in my own atheism and skepticism. I read his book, Flim Flam, which is a classic. It's like I always say it's like the holy trinity of skeptic books. You have Flim Flam by James Randi, Fads and Fallacies by Martin Gardner, and The Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan. That's like those three books. If you don't come out of those three books a skeptic, then I don't know what you'll be. But
something went wrong.
But something went wrong, exactly. So you had, I think, a very interesting story in the sense that you gravitated towards alternative styles of religion once the sort of the moved away from them, and you sort of tried to find different things, and then eventually you settled on atheism. And so it seems to me like this was a very gradual process for you then.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I was never cemented in anything, and I guess in a sense you could say that I was always kind of trying to find something that fit, and it never really did until, like you say, I found, well, wait a second, reality fits.
Yeah. We spend so much time, and I think a lot of this has to do with how religion is so palatable to people. We spend so much time trying to cloud our sense of reality, some of which is justified in the sense that we want to be careful about how we view the world. We want to be careful with our perceptions. One thing I say all the time is that perceptions are not knowledge. Just because you perceive something doesn't make it true. And so it's very important to make the distinction between what you sort of see every day and then what's actually there, because they are two different things. And the problem is, I think, as you've said, is that you can take that to an extreme where you sort of can accept any reality or any conclusion, regardless of whether or not it's true. And that clouding of of people's thinking is, I think, where people get astray. Yeah,
for sure. That's where that Deepak Chopra type philosophy kind of takes hold, right? He says things they sound nebulous and true in a sense. You go, oh, well, what I see isn't reality, and oh, well, that means that reality isn't a thing.
Yeah, exactly. Or we get into and with him, he is the master of what Daniel Dennett called a deepity, something that sounds incredibly profound, but actually doesn't mean anything. He has a very good patina of sort of wisdom, but when you really break it down, it's very cultured nonsense. It always reminds me of a quote from a radio personality named Dennis Prager, who I don't agree with on most anything, but he had a great quote, which is that only something that stupid could come out of a mouth of someone who went to college. And, and I think that's a fair point in some respects. So what are you working on now? So I know you've got a bunch of different podcast projects, and you are definitely working on a bunch of stuff. And I mean, I see all of the different things that you put out, and I'm dizzy with the amount of content you put out. I mean, you must be a very busy guy.
Yeah, my job is actually pretty good in that when I'm on nights, I can sit generally in the office and work on things. And when I'm on day, it's a 7 on, 7 off shift. So I work hard for 7 days when I'm on days. And then I've got 7 days off where my girlfriend's at work and my kids are at school, and I can just work on other stuff. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's really nice.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing schedule. I don't know that I could actually find a job that could cater my hobbies as much as this one does.
I feel the same way about mine. I'm a public historian. I work for a state agency here in Indiana, digitizing historic newspapers. And my job is a regular sort of 9 to 5 office job, but it's not too taxing. And so one thing that's really nice about it is that I can create a lot of really cool content there and then come home.
Right.
And since I have set hours, I can just, work on the stuff I want to work on, and it's really nice.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's the thing. A lot of people, they have to work jobs that are really thought intensive or even really physically intensive, which my job is at times, but not consistently. So they don't have a 9 to 5 job with only weekends off. I don't know that I could do anything extra.
It's one of those things where, for me at least, what keeps me going is that my work is very thought intensive, but it's also very rewarding in that I'm creating content. So I go to work and I create history content, and then I come home and I make atheist content. Now, if I worked at a job where I had to do a lot of manual labor, or I did retail every day or something, maybe it would be different. But yeah, I mean, mind you, I only do one show a week. And then I do and then I write, and then I do some other things and this and that and the other. So how many shows do you have?
Technically I think of it as 2 shows.
Okay.
But I put out extra content for one of them a lot. So I've got Brainstorm, which is my main show. And generally it's a panel show. We go to a studio every 2 weeks, and we interview people, and we discuss a variety of topics, generally current events, relating to skepticism and atheism. And then I divide that into 2 shows that release on their own, but also release under the label Brainstorm.
Okay.
And then once a month, and that's the Skeptic Studio and the Shift to Reason Radio. So we kind of have a different focus for each week, but so that's why I figured we'd put it out as 2 separate shows if people were only interested in content from a particular type of vein, right?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. That's very, very interesting. So your main show, Brainstorm, so it's mostly, so you guys do current events? Do you guys do longer form segments? Kind of, what kind of content can people expect from your show?
Well, for the first hour, we always interview somebody, whether it's an author or a podcaster or a scientist, somebody whose field is something that has been touched on by the skeptical community. And then that usually so we usually do that for an hour. And then after that, I try to pick a topic where we can sit and just expound and argue and kind of have this kind of half-hour discussion about one topic.
That's really neat. That's really, really neat. That's similar to my show. My show as of late has been mostly more interview driven, which has been nice. But originally it started as as sort of a news show for atheists. I sort of pitched it to people who were interested as I called it the Rachel Maddow show for atheists in the sense that I did short form news items at the top, larger news items in the middle where I would read an article and then give my commentary. And then at the end, I would do something called the special comment, which is sort of like, if you've ever watched her show, she usually does like a long form segment towards the top. It's like 20 minutes. It's like a long story. I do that at the end, and mine usually tends to be between 5 and 10 minutes. I haven't done a format like that in a long time, just because my podcast has kind of blown up in some respects over the last couple weeks to a month, where I've just had more and more people who are interested in coming on, which is cool with me because I really enjoy conversations. That way it's not just my voice, but the only other thing I've ever done too in terms of format is an Ask Me Anything, where I did a whole episode where people just sent me questions and I answered them, and then I ended that with an essay. So I'll probably be doing another one of those soon, probably for the 20th episode, because this will technically be episode 19. So the 20th episode, I'll probably do an AMA. So that's kind of what my format is. And so there may be months where it's all interviews, and then it might be some months where it's all just the news stuff I've been doing. But it's been really nice. I've been in the podcasting space for about a year and a half, and this is the third show that I've done, and it's the one I think I'm the most happy with.
Okay.
So
what were your other shows?
So the other shows I used to do, the first show I ever did was a show called An Army of Principles, which was a joint venture between me and an online community called Philosophical Atheism. Okay. And I ran that show for 6 or 7 months, and then for a short time I joined the Atheist Alliance of America, and through them I did a few episodes of their show Secular Nation, and we sort of revamped that show. When my professional relationship with both of those organizations ended, I sort of got out of the podcasting space for a while, and then a friend of mine, it's interesting. I didn't have the best experience working for those organizations, and so I was ready to just be done with it for a while. But I had a great conversation with a friend of mine, who is actually, it's really hard to describe. He's like the most liberal Christian you can imagine. I don't even know if he'd be comfortable calling himself a Christian, but he's like an esoteric Christian. And we had these series of dialogues back and forth. And he said, you really should do your podcast again. And then maybe you and I can have a long conversation or something. And so he kind of inspired me to get back into space. And so I started Reason Revolution back in June. And Tyler and I, my friend Tyler Levins, and I eventually did that episode. I think it's episode 9, which is called The Future of Faith. And we do a dialogue together on his website, Christianity Now, about secularism and religion.
That's very cool.
Thanks. Yeah. So I love doing it. I mean, it's a lot of fun, and so I like this space a lot, and there's so many people in it, which I think is really, really cool.
Yeah. I have highs and lows with it, where you create a bunch of content, you're getting that high from like doing something creative and getting your voice out into the world. And then, I mean, it's nice if somebody's listening to it.
Yes.
So I get the lows every now and then when you go, oh, there's not very many people listening to this.
I totally get that. I mean, I think the thing is, I watched one piece of advice I always go with, because my podcast is new. I mean, I average somewhere between 25 and 50 people an episode. But it's growing, and our Facebook is pretty small. But there was a YouTuber who did a video and who talked about how, I did my YouTube channel a certain way, and I was so obsessed with getting the clicks and getting the hits and this and that and the other. But I was so obsessed with those numbers that my content really kind of suffered as a result of it. And so he said, when I started trying it again, I just didn't care about any of that. I made the content that I wanted to. And he just said that people came to it eventually. I do this as a hobby. I don't intend to make money off of it. I don't make money off of it. I don't have a Patron or anything like that. To be honest with you, my audience isn't large enough to warrant one. I would feel bad to set one up with an audience as small as mine. I've always said that once my Facebook page gets to like 1,000 followers. And once my episodes get to maybe 100, 150 to 200 people an episode, somewhere around those lines, then I'll probably start talking about the idea of doing like a Patreon or something. But I have a full-time job. It pays decently.
Right.
And so the only thing that I have to pay for with this is my SoundCloud account. But other than that, everything I do is so it's really a labor of love, and I do it because I enjoy doing it, and it's a passion of mine.
Yeah, we started off just with a headset mic in my buddy's house in his living room, and we're sitting around it and bullshitting, eh?
Mm-hmm.
And when I was doing the editing, listening back to it, like my ego was so large at the time that I was like, "This is brilliant. People are gonna love this. I'm starting a Patreon account." So, I thought after the first one we were gold, and since then my level of humility has increased dramatically. Like,
yeah, it's the thing is too is that one of the beautiful things about podcasting and just the internet in general is it's this great democratizer of ideas, where you and me, a generation ago, hell, even a decade or so ago. We would have had to have like bought professional equipment or gone to a professional studio and pitched a show, an idea, and had a producer and this and that and the other. And now we can just do it this way. Now that leads to obvious pitfalls because, for every person that you may like that creates content that you think is entertaining or informative, there's like 100 people who make garbage. So it's a mixed bag, but I think that more of it is better than less. And, and the good and the bad will get settled at the end.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny that, because we actually go to a studio for our panel show.
Mm-hmm.
I have a buddy who he undercharges me, but we go to a professional studio and have a professional sound engineer do our live broadcast. And
that's awesome.
And then it's really, I think it helps with the show so that we can focus more on content, because I do my solo show, the Hardcore Skeptic Examines, and I do any bonus content for Brainstorm at home on my own stuff. And I spend so much time nitpicking about the sound quality and worrying that this mistake in the sound quality is going to take away from what somebody hears in the content, that it takes me 3 weeks to put out episodes sometimes. Like,
that's understandable. I mean, most of the episodes that I've ever done, the conversations were good enough, and a lot of it I'd written out beforehand. So I do everything through Adobe, and I have my iMac, and then I have just my little blue snowball microphone that I plug in, and then I just do everything myself, which is fun because it's kind of my little thing that I can do besides my other real love, which is reading. So okay. But no, I think that's really, really cool. And I'd like to get to a place where at some point I get a little bit of a nicer mic. And then some of the conversations I do in interviews via Skype, I can do with my mic and it sounds better and things like that. Then it's For just, sure. I'm just trying to grow it at a pace that's comfortable for me, because I always tell people that, the moment this stops being fun is the moment I stop doing it.
Yeah, that's fair. No, that is definitely fair. I think sometimes my eyes are bigger than my stomach, as it were.
Yeah.
Because I always want to keep, I need a new mic. I need a new interface. I need an actual computer that can record well. And like, I'm looking at all this money that I'm going to have to spend, and it does seem a little daunting sometimes,
mm-hmm.
but you don't have to have all of that to make it work. Like, that's the great thing about podcasting.
I think so. I think what's really beautiful is the rate at which technology both gets better and cheaper is fantastic. And then, I mean, honestly, yeah. Like you can get you get a SoundCloud account like I have, or you can do Podbean, or you can do Blog Talk Radio, or you can do Stitcher. Like, there's a whole bunch of different ways to put content out that are so easy. So.
Yeah, we actually are on Spreaker and Libsyn. And
very cool.
Yeah, like, and I mean, it costs enough to keep both of those accounts going, but I have a decent job, so so I can afford to do that a little bit extra, and I think that just that the more people we can get our content out to, the better off we are, and the better our community can be, I guess.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think, I went with SoundCloud originally because that's how I had done all my other podcasts and was comfortable with it. Now, SoundCloud, as of late, has had some serious, I think, structural and financial problems. So maybe at some point, if SoundCloud goes under, I'll switch over to something else. But for right now, I've got it, and I like the way it's set up, and people know it's there, and it's easy to search. And so, my hope is that, SoundCloud will stay going well for a long time. If not, I'll likely switch to Podbean because it's comparable in terms of price.
Yeah. They say, like I say, I listen to The Feed. It's the Libsyn podcast about podcasting.
Uh-huh.
And they kind of have left me with the impression that if you can get your content onto iTunes, then you're good. Like as long as iTunes can get it, then every other podcatcher can get it, and you're in good shape.
And that's exactly what it is with SoundCloud, because it generates my RSS feed, and I'm right there on iTunes, and I'm pretty much everywhere else. I mean, I only really advertise the three main platforms I'm on, which is SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. But I know that I'm also on, you can get me on the Google Play Store. You can get me on a bunch of other stuff that you have or whatever. But yeah, those are the three main ones that I do. So.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I didn't expect this. Is kind of this is kind of an inside baseball conversation. So let's change gears a little bit. So
sure.
What motivated our conversation was you had made a post, I think, on Facebook about saying something about that the tendency that you've seen, particularly online, is that people who identify themselves as being sort of quote unquote classical liberals are often arrogant assholes. And I went, which is a fair point to make. So I went to the comment thread and I said, look, I'm somebody who identifies in some respects as a classical liberal. And I can tell you there's an incredible amount of arrogance that comes out of that movement. And in libertarianism in general, I was just somebody who was in libertarianism for a long time and was sort of a student activist in libertarianism in college. And I can tell you that, yeah, there's a certain amount of arrogance. And part of it has to go with the near religious thinking sometimes that they have, where libertarians or classical liberals often think that they have the answers to every question. And so, which I think is a problem. And so in my comment thread, I mentioned something about, I think, the value of being somebody who is like me, somebody who's sort of a moderate, somebody who's center left. I identify on the left, but I'm sort of left of center, and is influenced by classical liberalism, is a certain level of humility about politics, about life, about knowledge, and that a multiplicity of perspectives helps us. And so I just kind of wanted to have an interesting conversation about unpacking sort of what prompted your post and what are some of the pitfalls that you see within this sort of growing movement that's some of which is in the atheist movement of classical liberalism, or what is broadly termed the new center, which I've talked about on my podcast before too.
Well, I think, I guess what prompted the post was actually, I guess, to be honest, it's a bit of pettiness on my behalf. Because I see people posting about, and it's always attacking the left, right? Oh, the left, I can't even remember whose post I saw, but it was Melissa Chen commented on somebody's post, and it was this long thing, and the mental gymnastics that she would have had to get to defend her position seemed like a religious person, I have the truth and you are just this idiot who has picked a side, and picking sides is for the stupid, and just this smug level of I don't know. It seemed so insulting to anybody who's taken a stance on an issue. I just couldn't grasp how somebody can just avoid taking stances as a virtue.
Yeah, and I don't think it is one. So one of the problems I have is that I live by a very old notion that's a part of, broadly the liberal tradition. And it comes from a classical liberal himself, Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of our country,
Right.
who said that those who stand for nothing fall for anything.
Right.
And so there's this idea that somehow that if you're a part of this newer movement that's asking for more sort of enlightened, rational dialogue in our politics, that somehow you don't believe in something. There are many things that I very, very vehemently believe in. I believe in the freedom of speech. I believe in a woman's right to choose. I believe in marriage equality. I believe in the legalization of marijuana.
Right.
I believe in the decriminalization of all drugs. I believe we should end the drug war. I believe that we should stop fighting all of these wars around the world to try to define democracy for them when we can barely define it ourselves. There's certain principles that I do hold. And so the issue that I see a lot lately, because, I'm a follower of a lot of some of the folks that you might have issues with, who I don't always agree with. I listen to Dave Rubin a lot. And,
Right.
and I like Dave Rubin. I like the fact that Dave Rubin has the balls to bring on people who I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole.
Right.
And that takes a certain level of balls. But at the same time, there's, and as much as I like him too, there are things that he does that drive me crazy. One, his absolute trashing of the media, which I don't like.
Right.
Which, because I'm sorry, but I wrote a blog about this a while back, and it became a comment on my podcast about the value of journalism to democracy. Now, journalists get stuff wrong all the time, and they fuck things up, and they should be held accountable for that. But this idea that he constantly says it on his show about how, the mainstream media is dying, and this and that and the other. I'm like, no, it's not. It's just taking a different form. Just because a lot of people may watch and listen to you doesn't mean that the traditional forms of media are dying. They're not. They're just changing. Now, they make tremendous amount of mistakes. So for example, in the piece that I wrote, I talked about the 3 journalists who were fired from CNN, or they had to resign for running a piece about the Trump-Russia scandal before the sources were fully vetted. And they resigned for that. And they said, look, we made a mistake and we resigned. That's making the right decision. Now, at the same time, when a Redditor commenter says something, I remember what this was. So remember a while back when Trump tweeted out that GIF of him body slamming a person with CNN's logo over the guy's head?
Yeah.
And apparently that GIF was tied back to a user on Reddit named Han Asshole Solo.
Yep.
So apparently when CNN they basically posted the guy's name. They figured out who he was, where he was, and they said that they essentially blackmailed him to a certain extent, where they were like, if you don't renounce what you've done, we'll run this and that and the other about you. Now, I think that's complete horseshit. Now, I don't like Trump at all, and I don't really like the GIF, and I don't really know all that much about Reddit, but I know that some places of it are kind of dark and scary. I know the same thing about, I guess, of a place called 4chan. But it's a real problem that a journalistic institution would use private information of an individual in order to get them to do what they want. That's pretty fucked up. And the media should be held accountable for something that egregiously immoral, regardless of how you feel about the GIF. What CNN wanted to do is actually worse than the GIF itself, in my opinion. So it's okay to critique things, but notice that I went from the general to the specific. The problem with somebody like Melissa Chen, from what I'm hearing from what you did, is they went from the specific to the general, and that's where they have a huge problem.
Yeah, that happens a lot. Where I did a couple interviews for my solo show with people who I considered on the left, but who were anti-SJWs.
Mm-hmm.
And they would do that. They would spend a lot of time taking examples of a person behaving badly, or even an organization behaving in a way that could be considered questionable, and then saying, so therefore the left has this problem. And I take issue with that, because obviously not everybody on the left is going to endorse X person doing a bad thing. Like the one of the examples was a group of young black people apparently pulling a person out of a car and beating him up. And the person was a white person, and the argument was that it represents Black Lives Matter. Well, I think that's obviously false. If anybody thinks about it for even a second, like obviously these people are not necessarily representative of anyone besides themselves as individuals.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I mean, the other issue that I've had lately has been, one of my hobby horses and why I've sort of, I don't know, implicitly, or I guess in this case now explicitly sort of hitched myself to this idea of the new center, is what is going on in college campuses. I'm very distressed by the idea that students are holding protests, which often become, in some respects, violent. What happened to the female liberal professor at Middlebury College who tried to interview Charles Murray? She was physically assaulted by students for merely being there to ask him questions. I think that's a huge problem. And it's, in my opinion, an illiberal position. Authoritarians and thugs are the kind of people that use violence and intimidation to get what they want. It's not liberal to do that. It's not on the left to do that. So when I see people who identify as a part of the left doing that, I have a huge problem. But I do agree with you in the sense that it's not all of the left. I would say It's a very vocal minority that often sets the narrative for everybody else.
Yeah, I see that a lot with the college campus debate too, is that like these examples of people at Middlebury, or even activists at Berkeley breaking windows, or whatever it happens to be, that makes the news. And it gets written about over and over and over again. But the number of protests that turn violent at college campuses is remarkably low. Like there's like 4,700 college campuses in the US. And it's like, okay, so we're calling 15 or 16 or even 25 or even 100 college campuses representative of college campus free speech on being attacked. And I think it's a mischaracterization of what's actually happening.
I think that's a fair point. What I would say, just as a corollary to that, I guess, is that one of the things that we've seen is that a majority of these kinds of protests are coming out of elite universities. So they're coming out of Berkeley, they're coming out of Yale, they're coming out of Harvard. And I think the issue that people are trying to raise here is that oftentimes what these major universities do, some of which are identified in the US as the Ivy League, most of which aren't public universities, most of these that we're kind of discussing in this conversation, with the exception of Berkeley, a lot of them are private, right. Is that they set the national tone for how universities deal with things. Now, one of the other larger trends that is a problem, that is, I think, a problem for a vast majority of college campuses, is the vast amounts of administration and logistics that they've had to bring into universities as a result of these attempts to sort of deal with issues on college campuses. So every time there's an issue that a college has, they create some random ass administrative department to deal with it. This leads to a couple things that I think are a big problem, which is why it's in some respects a snake eating itself. One, when you have this increase of administration, the cost of going to college gets higher, and public universities in particular here in the United States don't get as many resources from the state government or the federal government as they should. So students have to then take out student loans. That in effect makes them customers rather than students. Yes. And so administrations have to do essentially customer service, and it's extremely expensive. And so this is where I'm running into a problem, where every time that somebody makes a claim about something, or every time that we have to do something in the name of, whatever social cause you want to do, we have to hire a bunch of people to have meaningless jobs to do meaningless things that makes college more expensive, which in turn makes students have to pay more. And when they pay more, they tend to have a little bit more say in how things are run. That's really where I have a problem with stuff. And that is a trend that's happening on college campuses. I mean, the amount of administration and tuition costs in America have skyrocketed over the last 2 decades.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's, well, I mean, I know that myself and many people that I kind of follow would probably say that that's an issue with not socializing education.
Yeah, actually, that would be a point I would make, which is that one of the benefits of having publicly funded colleges where tuition is free for students is that they are actually students again, and they stop being customers. And then you can avoid some of this bullshit because they are students again. No, I think that's a fair point. That's where I'm solidly on the left on that one.
Yeah, I think that a lot of this issue would, as long as students are paying for school, then you have to listen to what they're saying. That was, I had a debate a while back about, is deplatforming a thing that colleges should do? And as I'm of the position that as long as students are paying tuition, then they have to have a say in what goes on their school campus, and the administration will have to weigh that income that they may lose if those students choose to go to a different school or whatever. Like there's reputation, that capital that they could lose. There's a very good, I think, capitalist argument for colleges deciding to deplatform people or disinvite people.
No, I think you're right. I think that's exactly why we're seeing some of the problems we're seeing, is because administrations have to do this widespread level of customer service. I just think that it's really telling about college campuses in the United States that somebody like, I don't know, like a orthodox Marxist, someone who may have been a part of a violent group in the 60s or the 70s, somebody who was a part of the Weather Underground or something like that, can go to a college campus and there's fucking crickets. Nobody cares. It's when somebody who says things that are not on the orthodox liberalism or the orthodox leftist spectrum, people like Ben Shapiro, who I don't necessarily like or agree with on much, but the sheer fact that they had to spend so much money in order for him to come to campus simply by virtue of the fact that kids didn't like what he had to say, that's bullshit. I mean, I'm sorry, like that's just flat out bullshit. And it speaks volumes about a larger trend that's going on, which is that there is a politics in this country and in the United States, and it exists on the left and on the right, that the ends justify the means. And I don't buy that one bit. Because all we, it's like as Penn Jillette says, we don't have ends. We only live in the means. So,
right.
If we're constantly trying to do horrible shit in the name of whatever cause you have, whether it's Make America Great Again or, Black Lives Matter or whatever, which again, for listeners, before I get the hate mail, I'm not equating the two. That I think that's a huge issue here. And that's really where I'm just dumbfounded. And I do think that's a problem on the left. I don't think it's the left as a monolith, but I do think it's a problem.
Yeah, I think there's a bit to unpack there, isn't there? Like,
sure, go for it.
That where you started there. The starting point where you. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I lost you for a second.
Yeah, I kind of thought something happened there, but
yeah, go for it.
Like the starting point of where there's crickets when what might be considered a problematic left speaker is going to a college campus versus the outrage and protest that happens when a problematic right speaker comes to college campuses. I think that may. I think there's there's something to that where obviously protesters have the freedom to protest. Obviously speakers should have the freedom to speak, but it might just be that the ideas of a leftist are more accepted on college campuses, so there's less people who would protest, and it doesn't make news, or it doesn't get spoken about much. And there might be something to the idea that try to parse my thought out here a little bit.
Sure.
Good thing this isn't live.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're fine. We'll edit out the gaps in post. You're fine.
Sure, sounds good. I just wonder, because the things that say a Ben Shapiro says are things that a group of people can protest, and I think they have a justified position in their protest. I would not advocate for violence by any stretch, but or breaking things or what have you. And yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought.
No, you're fine. I think I know where you're going with that. So, I mean, what I mean is this idea that a college campus, and one of my favorite authors, Jonathan Haidt, did a really great discussion about this. Now, he may have set up a false dichotomy, and I'd like to maybe hear pushback about this, because I think you might have a perspective that's different than mine. But I really like Jonathan Haidt's description. Either universities are going to be institutions dedicated to truth, or they're going solely to truth, or they're going to be institutions solely devoted to social justice. They can't be both, because they're going to come so they're going to come into conflict with one another. So when a university like Brown recently said, like, yeah, we're going to be a university devoted to social justice, okay, that's fine. But then don't automatically claim yourself as this bastion of openness and truth, because you've already kind of set up an agenda. It's very much akin to when a private Christian school wants to do the same thing. And that's kind of the distinction that Haidt makes. And so what I think I'm more interested in is, I have no problem. Like, for example, I wildly disagree with Ben Shapiro on pretty much everything. And I don't like somebody like a Milo or whatever, or Ann Coulter. But having said that, and I think students have all the right in the world to protest, they have all the right in the world to organize, they can do a counter talk where somebody else speaks and things like that. I have no problem with that at all. What I have a huge issue with is the idea that universities had to spend 6 figures to protect somebody because they were so worried about organized people who were going to come out and hurt people and break shit. And I think that's a huge problem, whether it was a speaker coming from the left or a speaker coming from the right. It shouldn't have to matter. You know, just because somebody's positions when whatever their speech is, whether it's acceptable or not, shouldn't really matter all that much. You know, it should be kind of on the same plane if you're in a public university. Or a university dedicated to the free expression of ideas. And so I don't think that, what Haidt is saying is not that the ideas of social justice are incompatible with a free exchange of ideas. That's not what he's saying. But when you have a university whose dedication to one or the other becomes a problem, that's when you lose the script, and that's really the problem. I firmly believe that a university dedicated to truth and dedicated to the free expression of ideas will have a high degree of social justice. But I think a university solely devoted towards this social engineering of some sort, whether it's social justice on the left or like a private Christian college on the right, you're going to lose a certain level of truth there, because there are going to be things about the exchange of ideas that are uncomfortable to those agendas. And so this is where I have found myself at odds with some of the left. But mainly just that's because the left owns the university in this country. They just do. When the new left came into power in the 60s, they retreated into the universities and they never left. And so that's just the nature of the beast. The left took over the colleges and the right took over the boardrooms. That's just the nature of how America went.
Yeah, I think that it's difficult to say, because I have found in my exploration of the subject of social justice is that it is largely based on factual things. So a university like Brown that says it's dedicated to social justice is not dichotomous with truth. It's compatible with truth, because truth carries with it this sense of a just and fair society, I think.
No, and I think you're right. So what I would say is that I think the issue that we run into is not so much that the facts and truth and knowledge lead to justice and human flourishing, which I very much believe they do. It's why I'm an atheist. It's why I'm a skeptic, and it's why I'm in the broadest sense of the term a liberal. But what I guess my issue is when you start with the position of this is my ideological point, and I'm going to stick to this point regardless of whatever comes my way, and that has nothing, and that's not just social justice, which I don't think has this problem as bad as people like to think it has. I do agree with you that I think that the right in this country tend to over-exaggerate the craziness because, to be completely honest with you, the people that they complain about have no fucking institutional power. They can't do anything. Right. Like the only institutional power they have would be in academia, which I do think is a problem. I mean, one of the problems that we've seen is this sort of, I think, bastardization or this sort of extreme postmodernism that is creeped into the humanities, which is sadly then creeping into the sciences. The idea that truth is subjective, that truth is only a construction of power, and these kinds of concepts, which I think are a huge problem, because at the end of the day, no amount of power negates the fact that, that 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen make water, and that there are certain facts that are discernible about the world. And the moment that we deny that is the moment that we then get into a wasteland of your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth, and this and that's crap. There's stuff that is discernible that's better than others, and it's the relativism that I have a huge problem with.
Yeah, again, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Like I think that the idea that postmodernism is subjectivity writ large, I think that's a mistake, because many of the things that we experience, we know that our brains are unreliable. We know that our perceptions of situations aren't always perfect, and that we can be socialized into certain attitudes and certain beliefs that we don't even truly consciously express, but that come out in other ways. And we know that through things like implicit bias that these things affect people. And it's this level of, I think that's the deconstruction that is important, is the asking of, well, why is that way? What did we do to get to there, and how did society end up in this spot?
And I think all of that's valuable. I have no problem with that. Part of that goes back to, the notion of Humean skepticism, which I think is a valuable point of view. I think what I'm more concerned with is this idea that we are going to disregard realities about human beings and human nature in an attempt to try to engineer a better world. And that's, one of my favorite books is The Blank Slate by Steven Pinker. And he talks about how there are 3 myths that motivate societies that we need to let go of in order to be better. One of them is the blank slate, the idea that the brain is just an empty canvas upon which any idea can be accepted or rejected. The second one is the noble savage, the idea that somehow, simply by virtue of something being natural or being ancient, somehow it has a virtue about it. It doesn't. Yeah. And the third one is the ghost in the machine, the idea that there is a soul, or that there's something implicit about something that can be discernible from reality, when in reality it can't. What I'm seeing in our sort of trend in our culture, and some of which I see it on both sides of the political spectrum, is the denial of who human beings actually are. And in an attempt to sort of, now look, I'm a civil libertarian. I believe people should live however the hell they want to. This is not the issue here. What I'm really worried about is the idea that we're going to build a society in which agendas are more important than reality. And that's really where I have a huge problem, is that we need to have policy that's based on science. We need to have policy that's based on sound ethics. And we need to have a policy that's based on as our best approximation of reality. You know, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And we're living in a world now where people can just sort of go into their little bubbles and into their own ideological biases, as you've said, implicit biases, which I think is a fair point. And we no longer have the conversation about difficult subjects for fear of being, you know, called whatever. You know, if you have a difficult discussion about, you know, race or something like that, people will just call you a racist without actually looking at the content of your work. And that's on the left. On the right, if you somehow criticize American foreign policy, or you criticize Trump, they'll call you a globalist cuck. You know, it's this constant name calling instead of actually having a discussion, because we're so obsessed with maintaining an agenda that I'm very concerned with.
I'm not. I mean, I spend a lot of time attacking the right and arguing about the right, but I want to I guess, defend the left in a certain sense here.
Go for it.
I think that what people perceive as name calling, i.e. racism or sexism, like if people perceive being called racist or sexist as being called a name. And quite often I feel like that's a misunderstanding of the situation. I think that people are talking past each other too much, and that if someone is called a racist, then it's probably a good idea to, rather than get defensive, they should probably try to understand why somebody might think what they said was racist or did, you know. And like I want to, because you mentioned that certain ideas we don't want to discuss certain difficult ideas, but I think that some of these ideas have been discussed, and we've, in a sense, debunked them in the same way that we've debunked creationism. And like racial ideas, the idea that race determines IQ, as I know that a lot of people really are sticking to this one, but it isn't actually supported by anything that like empirical. It's a lot of conclusions drawn through correlation without context. And I think that these kinds of things have been pointed out multiple times, but that now then new people come and they go, oh, well, here's this idea, but nobody wants to talk about it. And if they just put in the effort, they could see that it's been talked about already.
Sure. And there was a rich, diverse discussion about the work by Richard Hernston and Charles Murray and the bell curve. I mean, there was a whole book, an academically peer-reviewed book of criticism of the bell curve. You know, Stephen Jay Gould wrote an entire book that's sort of a refutation of the bell curve called The Mismeasure of Man. So I do think you're right. I think it's a fair point to say that there are often times where people say, oh, we can't discuss this. I think on that regard, I do think you're right. I think that one's been thoroughly discussed. I think what I'm very concerned with is the idea that somebody like Charles Murray being called a racist, because I don't think he's a racist. I think he could be dramatically wrong. But I don't think that having an opinion like that as being simply wrong automatically merits you being a racist. Now, when somebody calls Trump a racist, I agree with that, because Trump is in fact a racist. There are demonstrable things about him being racist, like whether it was his discriminating with his father against low-income housing projects in Queens, when they took federal money to make low-income housing for people that's based on non-discrimination rules, and they discriminated against people anyway. That was racist. Or when he ran a full page ad, basically saying that the Central Park Five should be executed, even though it was found years later that they were fully exonerated of all charges. That was racist. There's stuff that Trump does that is legitimately racist. I have no problem with that. But what I think is a huge problem is this idea that scholarship, which could certainly be wrong, and you know, and I'm, you know, what I guess my main concern is this idea that we want to make sure that we're in a diverse environment of ideas where even raising certain questions doesn't automatically get someone pegged as a racist, unless the questions themselves are inherently racist. I mean, like some of the things that Richard Spencer says are fucking racist. Like there's no doubt about it. So right. I guess that's really my main issue. But I totally understand where you're coming from about that there is this thing of just like some of the right saying, oh, we didn't talk about this. Yeah, we did. We did have a long discussion about this. Like the one that really is my pet peeve, because I'm an historian, is the one about the Civil War. When people say, oh, well, it's not about slavery. No, the Civil War was about slavery. You know, and you can say things about, oh, it's the level of tariffs or states' rights and this and that and the other. Those were all ancillary effects of racism that was implicit with the practice of slavery. Like it's built into it. So, you know, that does drive me absolutely fucking nuts. So when I see people who have Confederate flags and shit, it's like, it's heritage, not hate. No, it's both heritage and it's hate, in the sense that it's history based on the idea of a insurrection against the United States of America to found a country solely based on the predicate idea that there is an entire group of people who you think are inferior and you're going to enslave, and that is God's plan to do that. So that is horseshit. And you know, I don't think anybody who is intellectually honest will say shit like that.
No, I think that's fair.
You know, it's all about distinctions, really.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, because as much as it's easy to think of something as a negative and then dismiss it, right? Or whatever, or think of the left as this group that is anti-free speech and anti-intellectual, and it's easy to think of the right as anti-intellectual or what have you. But in almost all of these discussions, there is a level of nuance, and the effort just has to be there to look for it.
I totally agree. And I think that's part of why I'm often reticent about some of the broader problems, the broader things that people like to say. I mean, there are certain issues that I do think are a problem. So the issue of students on college campuses not terribly favoring free speech, it looks like that doesn't have anything to do with ideology. If you look at both the right and the left college campuses, if you look at students on both sides of the aisle, they're for limiting some forms of speech. So it's not something that's owned by the left. And you know, I know that people like to have a certain hobby horse about certain things. Like I know that some on the right love to go after Antifa. And some of that's legitimate in the sense that some of the black bloc that break stuff and beat people up and things like that, I get it. I understand that. But to put them on the same moral plane as like the violent white supremacists, like that's a huge problem. You know, they're both doing things that we would find problematic within the context of a free and open and peaceful society. It just so happens that one of them is wildly worse than the other, because one of them is predicated like the Confederacy predicated the idea that certain people are lesser than others. So my main issue is that it goes back to the classic quote from Sam Harris, where he says, we either have speech or we have violence. And you know, that's really the important thing. So discussions, debates, difficult conversations about difficult subjects, I think are essential to a flourishing democracy. And if we're not comfortable with those conversations, then we are then really only going to resort to the ad hominem, the name calling, the broad brush painting, which then eventually I think leads to violence. And that's really the problem, which is part of my pitch for joining the New Center, which is this idea that even though I'm still part of the left, that we need to establish a certain rationality and respect for one another in our politics.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds fair. I think, yeah, no, I can't really disagree with that. Like, I think that even people that are horrible are people, and there's a chance that if you don't call them names and attack them personally, you will maybe get through to one or two. You know, you might get through to people in some ways if you actually will engage with them.
Sure. So one of the big hot topics that is kind of a corollary to all of this, and I think next week I'll have Karen Garst on, and I'll be speaking later this week, I think, with a person who helped organize it to get some. What are your thoughts about what went down with MythCon? Because as much as I've said here tonight, I just want to unequivocally say that I think that what I'm talking about, bringing civility and discourse to politics, I think that's the very opposite of what somebody like Carl Benjamin, a.k.a. Sargon of Akkad, is doing.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree. I am still relatively new to the YouTube world. I started doing my Hardcore Skeptic series in March. I started doing a bunch of interviews regarding the subject of social justice. And for the anti-SJW people that I was interviewing, a lot of them pointed me to YouTube atheism and YouTube skeptics, and Sargon of Akkad was one of those channels. But I have trouble even getting through an entire video without taking a break because he's just awful. and the actions at MythCon, like I would never have in a million years have ever even thought to invite somebody like that to a conference.
Yeah, I wouldn't have either. Well, and originally I guess it was supposed to have been Dave Rubin, but then Rubin backed out and then it became Sargon. And my whole thing is like, it really did not look good. You know, it was, no. And part of it had to do with the fact that like, there was this, some of it was sort of being provocative, right? So like, from what I gather from what I've read online and what people have done podcasts about who've talked about this, was that when he came out on stage and they did that discussion, which became a shit show, the vast majority of those who were in the audience, or a good portion of them anyway, were not even there for the rest of the convention. That they were there specifically to see him. Many of them weren't even skeptics. Many of them weren't even atheists. Many of them were Trump supporters. Many of them they identified as Christians. They came in just to see this discussion. And I think that Matt Dillahunty made a great point in his video he did about MythCon, which is that the whole controversy about the things that Carl Benjamin said on his Twitter regarding Jess Phillips, the British MP, is that what Matt Dillahunty said was great, which is that if you had a problem with her idea of policing certain content online to help prevent sexual assault or sexual harassment, then you needed to make a very informed, based on evidence, rebuttal to what kind of proposals that she was making. But that's not what he did. Instead, he did what people who are sort of YouTube shit stirrers do, where he says the horrible shit that he said, which I'm not going to repeat here because fuck him. He's not getting it again. And so when I see him saying things about being a classical liberal, that's crap. Yeah. Because here's one of the big things about classical liberalism. If you read Adam Smith, if you read John Stuart Mill, the classical liberal thinkers, even the founders, the American founders like Jefferson and Madison, that freedom and liberty came with a certain amount of personal responsibility and personal restraint. That you used your liberty in a way that promoted the goodwill towards others and goodwill towards your cause. That's not it. that's just being an asshole for the sake of getting YouTube clicks. And I understand like he was trying to make some broader point, but that's lost on most people. Because as George Carlin says, think of the average person and then remember that half of them are dumber than that. So it's really like, it's very important to remember that people are going to take it a different way. And so the idea of that entire crowd just like wildly applauding the things he said was just irresponsible.
Well, and I have not seen evidence to convince me that he's doing anything other than just post hoc rationalizations. He felt the urge to tweet at her because his feelings were hurt about her attacking his free speech or whatever the hell. And he wanted to hurt her. And that's what that was. And I mean, he might want to say after the fact that he had this justification and he was arguing against her policies. And it just is, I don't see any reason why that would be the case.
I think that's fair. I think that's totally fair, because if that was really the case, he would have been more thoughtful the first time around.
Exactly.
And see, this is what gives the idea of criticizing certain ideas a bad name, because I do think there is certainly a lot to criticize about the nature of the extreme left, but the way that he does it is not conducive to making, I think, clear intellectual points. I mean, I think the thing that he did that I liked the most was his like 3-part series about individualism versus collectivism, which I quite liked. And he's not stupid, and he understands philosophy, he understands politics. But the problem that I have is that there's certain people who sort of sell their soul to the devil to get what they want, which is sort of exposure and this and that and the other. So yeah, he may have 500,000 YouTube views or 500,000 subscribers or whatever, but he's doing that in a way where he's sort of, I don't know, how would you say, he's cultivating a sort of a group of people or followers who are not really conducive to freedom. They're not really conducive to liberalism. They're not terribly conducive to the progress of human beings or the liberty of each individual person. Like, they don't really care about that. And that's kind of the thing, is from what people told me, like, he always talks about freedom, 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 which I think is great. I talk about it a lot on my show. But freedom also comes with responsibility. And the other component to a free society is equality. And we can have a discussion about the nature of how we do that equality, but equality before the law or the equality of opportunity or whatever. But that's a key component to an open society as well. And so I think that when you just say, I don't care about equality, I care about freedom, well, that really means you don't really care about either. Yeah,
I totally agree.
So, but anyway, I apologize if I've pontificated too long on this, but I feel very passionate about this because I feel like there's a lot of people who make a lot of noise and they're often full of it, and that's what makes me upset. So
I think that's fair. There are instances like, and I mean, I see the left as my side, right?
I do too.
So I mean, there are definitely instances where I see things that people say and I go, maybe that's not quite right. Maybe that's a little too far for, you're not helping our cause by doing that or saying that. But I do feel like there's a lot of straw men going on.
No, I think that's true. What's one of the bigger ones that you see that you think is a problem?
Oh, geez. I guess it depends where you look, because no matter where, it depends who you talk to, right? Because there's always people who will pick their straw man. The reverse racism is a big one. The reverse sexism, like feminism is ruling the world and keeping men down. That's a big one.
Yeah.
I think that there is a lot of straw manning of college campuses and college culture, but there are some legitimate concerns and some very good criticisms going on as well. I think that there might be more of a balance to that side of it, but I do think that I think that the straw manning of the left as authoritarian, when it might be a very small segment actually holds to authoritarian type perspectives, is an issue.
Yeah, and I would say that the authoritarianism that we are seeing that may exist on the left, which I do think some does, that's just indicative of a larger problem that is not exclusive to them. I mean, I would say that the authoritarianism that we've seen over the last couple of years on the right, with the rise of Trump, the way his rallies have been, people have been physically assaulted and this and that and the other. I think that authoritarianism is a growing problem around the world. It's not something that's exclusive to the left. So when I see people saying, well, the left is all authoritarian, I would say, well, no. And neither is all of the right. But what I think is a problem is this growing, I think Atheist Republic did a Twitter question, was like, what is the biggest problem facing the world today? And I said the growth of authoritarianism and the retreat of democracy. And I really do think that is the bigger problem. And what we're seeing that is a part of that, right, is part of a larger problem that is not exclusive to any political ideology. It's just a problem of growing where, since the 2008 financial crisis, people have had a huge amount of distrust, and not just the 2008 crisis, but as of recently, we had an economic crisis. We're now through that for the most part, and now we're feeling the parallel political crisis that would have happened had the economic crisis not. And so we're facing that around the world with the rise of Erdogan in Turkey, the rise of authoritarianism in some sectors of the Middle East and Southeast Asia. I'm thinking of Maduro, and then of course with Trump. And so it's not exclusive to just, bratty college kids on college campuses,
Yeah, for sure.
And that's really what I'm more interested in. It's just the bigger ideas. I understand that the other big thing that I have a problem with Sargon is he kind of retcons everything. So he'll pull an interview from somebody who's clearly saying something fucking dumb. And you can make a point, well, that's pretty stupid. But then he sort of stops and then talks over it. And it's just you're fitting this to how you want it to be. It's not really a conversation. It's it's somebody doing a roast of somebody else. It may not be funny, but it's certainly a political roast.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I actually I just watched him do that to David Paxman.
Yeah, I know who that is. Yeah.
And I watched the rebuttal by David Paxman, or I can never remember how to say his name.
Something like that, yeah. Paxman.
Paxman?
I think it might be Paxman, yeah, something.
But his rebuttal was quite good. It demonstrated pretty clearly to me, and I've seen it happen multiple times, where Sargon, or Carl, I guess we should call him by his human name.
He is not a god. We'll call him Carl.
Yeah, we'll call him Carl. Carl takes things and just ignores the context. He doesn't care if he can get a soundbite that he can rebut and make and pwn somebody. then that's what he'll do.
No, I think you're right, which is funny because then he gets shitty with people when they take him out of context. It's like, bro, you made a career doing that. It's not like, you need to calm your shit a little bit. The other issue that I think I see on this sort of growing trend of people is that there's a coziness to I think bad ideas that I'm not comfortable with. So for example, I like Dave Rubin. I watch Dave Rubin's show. There's occasional people on there who I think he shouldn't have given the time of day. And I'm like, why? But then I think about, it's his show and I don't listen to it or whatever. But at the same time, one of the criticisms that he gets is that he doesn't have enough people who are on the left on his show. Now, in fairness, there are some people on his show who are on the left. I mean, Mark Duplass was. I mean, he's had some people who are on the left on his show. John Fugelsang, who's been on his show. So it's not like he hasn't, but that's not really who he's catering to. Like, it's not really like
that's not his audience.
It's not his audience. Like, he's a center right guy. And so he's going to appeal for the most part to people who are either in the center or on the right.
Watch out though. He'll sue you if he catches you calling him right.
I know, which is crazy because, I don't think he, like, when news people put out hit pieces saying he cozies with the alt-right, I don't think that's necessarily true. Although I do find his sort of, I don't know what you would call it, his sort of bromance with Milo a little problematic. But but what I would say is that he literally took a political compass quiz and put it on his Twitter, and it literally showed him as center right. So if I'm going to call him center right, I'm going to go, dude, you just said it on your Twitter.
Look at this.
Look at your tweet. If you have a problem with me calling you center right, then go fuck yourself. Like, I mean, because in facts at that point don't mean anything to you. Or when he says things like, well, I mean, I think the only position that he really holds that's solidly on the left is universal health care. Which is funny because then he also tweets stuff about how much he's like, why does the government want to take more of my money? And I'm like, but it's going to have to create the universal health care you want. I mean, it's the thing about Dave is a guy who's sort of finding himself in real time and he's letting everybody watch it, which I think is kind of cool in some respects, that he's sort of going through an evolution of his politics and he's letting everybody in on the ride, which I think is kind of neat. But at the same time, like, that doesn't necessarily mean I always agree with the guy. Sometimes I think he's a bit hollow, that he's not, he has that problem of like not like having an opinion enough or like not being tougher with his guests and things like that. But I do think he's a decent interviewer. I like his conversations. I like some of the people he has on. I like other people he doesn't. But to show you where I fit on this, like, I watch Dave Rubin, but I'm also a massive Keith Olbermann fan, and I love Rachel Maddow, and I love Lawrence O'Donnell, and I'm a loyal MSNBC viewer. Like, I'm not, it's more akin, like, if it's more wrong to say I'm on the right than to say Dave is on the right.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
I tell people I'm just a Democrat that likes capitalism. I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's really what I am. I think that markets and I think that economic freedom leads to more peace and prosperity around the world. And if, but having said that, I do think that we need to have an economy that's built on fair play and fairness. And we need to have a social safety net. And I'm in favor of universal health care. But I'm also in favor of lowering corporate taxes. There's just certain things where I'm kind of all over the place, because what I'd like to have is an economy that's as free as it can be, so that it can generate the tax revenue in order to pay for all the social stuff we want to do.
Yeah, I think. I'm more of a. Well, I label myself as an anarcho-syndicalist, so I'm not really a capitalist. But we live in a capitalist world, so I function within that world as best I can. And I think that as long as we are in a capitalist world, then we do have to have regulations. We do have to have rules that govern companies and stop them from exploiting labor in ways that damage the lower income classes, right?
Sure. And to fight back against fraud and deception, which is the other big one. Markets are not perfect. They're not, it's not God. Like, I don't think it's God. It's on the whole, countries that tend to be more economically free tend to be better off. It's just the nature of the beast. And maybe if we had a society that was organized differently, like the model you described, or the model that I described, then maybe it could be a little bit different. I'm open to listening to those perspectives. I just think that my broader view of things is that I think the more freedom, the better. But that does not mean that you shouldn't be responsible for yourself. It doesn't mean you should just fuck people over, that you should just be an asshole. And I think, freedom implies a responsibility to yourself and to others. And so that certain level of freedom implies that you should be pretty damned responsible and pretty forthright in your actions.
Yeah.
So, well, Cory, this has been a blast, man.
For sure.
I have really enjoyed this. We can start wrapping up. I really appreciate your perspective. I appreciate the fact that, you were willing to come on and have a little bit of a discussion about some of these issues. I think you and I are not actually that far off on some of the big stuff.
Yeah, I agree. We're pretty damn close.
I think we're fairly damn close. And some of the larger things that we're worried about, I think we agree on. So where can people find your stuff?
The best place to find my stuff is at thebrainstormpodcast.com, or I'm still way behind on my show notes on our main website, but for information about all our different stuff, brainstormblog.net is our main website. And I guess you can find my solo show at Spreaker.com and just search for The Hardcore Skeptic Examines.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
And it's a blast, and maybe sometime I can come on your show in the future if you'll have me.
You bet.
Awesome. Take care, Cory.
Have a good one.
And that was my conversation with Cory Johnston. That's it for Reason Revolution this week. Please subscribe to us on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. If there's a platform you listen to podcasts on that I'm not on, please let me know and I'll try to make it happen. Send us your feedback at reasonrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com. Also go over to our Facebook page at facebook.com/reasonrevolution. Give us a like. We're growing all the time. Also, we have a brand new website. My friend and collaborator, Tyler Lovins, has put together an awesome new website for us. It's reasonrevolution.org. The two R's and the O in ORG are capitalized. No triple W's in the front. Just reasonrevolution.org. Two capital R's at the front of Reason and Revolution, and a capital O at the front of org. No W's at the beginning. reasonrevolution.org. All of our content's there. All the podcasts, all the articles, everything. And there's going to be a bunch of new essays as well. So definitely follow that. You can subscribe to us there. You can also follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at The Daily Clark. And until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.